Welcome back, everyone, and welcome, Lauren Randle. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sally. It's always good to be here.
So Lauren used to be a producer of our podcast, by the way, and we miss her, but so it's really especially good to have her back on the show. All right, so this segment is something that I think a lot of people don't think about, but it is really one of the most important things you can do, and that's to think about how to be kind once decisions are released. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Like, how do you think about this? And I'll just mention that Lauren, like myself, used to be a high school counselor as well as working in admissions. Lauren, you were actually a high school counselor at two institutions, just like I was. So kind of talk about that a little bit and how you think about this part of the process.
Sure. I think it's that perspective that taught me more about this than anything else. It's not so much my role as a college counselor now, but I'll get to that. But being in the high school setting really opened my eyes to this kindness factor. And I'm going to get sentimental just for a moment here. But when I think about this, it's actually one of my late mentors that gave the best advice. And he said it all the time, but written on his tombstone, it says, "It's not a secret. Just be a good person."
Mm-hmm.
That sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
I acknowledge the stress involved from summer until early release date. It is high emotion, stressful, anxiety. You don't know what's going to happen. And good or bad, like, you have to recognize that there is a collective here. You're still in a collective class. You are part of the class of 2024. And yes, this is about your future, but at the same time, some things are, not just about you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is absolutely a time to celebrate. If you get good news, it's a time to give yourself a moment or two. If you get bad news, that's okay. Just sit there and wallow for a second. And I think you guys are going to talk about next steps, but we're really focusing on kind of the reaction part of it. So it's okay to have those reactions, but I also think about like taking a step back and putting out good into the world and just being a good person. 'Tis the season.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so what are some concrete things? Because I do think that plenty of times students are trying to be good people, but they get into the college that's their top choice and they want to trumpet it to the rooftops. And that's a very understandable reaction. That does not, but what if their best friend was also helping to get in?
Sure.
Or even somebody that they're not close to, like kind of thinking about stuff like that. Like, how would you advise students in that circumstance?
Yeah, and I almost think that it's the inverse, maybe that, and not always. I don't always find this with the student that got into their dream school, because sometimes they are so shook by that reality that they almost don't even acknowledge it. Sometimes I find that's the case. What bothers and irks me the most is the ones that they took for granted. It's well, yeah, I got into my safety score. Oh yeah, I got $10,000 from X, Y, or Z, and the blowing it off that irks me more than anything, because that could be somebody else's reach school that they worked so hard and so proud to get into. Or maybe that is a reason that you end up going to that school because of a great offer or your family's, whatever it is. But it's the nonchalance of the acceptance to the ones they were expecting that really does bother me the most. And I think does the most damage to other students of how they perceive their offers. So I always start there, that every offer is a good offer. Like, take it, acknowledge it, and if somebody else gets in too, say, high five, me too. Like, right. We could be there together. That it's every offer is a win, and to celebrate those wins. I think that it's those unexpected ones, those reach, that there's a bit of shock value, and and announce it. That's great. You shouldn't try to pretend it didn't happen, right? You worked hard, you were acknowledged for this, and I think that that's really wonderful. But also realizing that probably the vast majority around you are still on pins and needles or did not get that same good news. So again, just be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just I'm gonna say it. I think that it's not always or usually the student that
Mm-hmm.
this is the issue.
Yeah.
It's a lot of times it's those parents. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's the message for the parents who are more of our listeners, I think, than students is, you know, it comes from a place of love. You love your kid, you're proud of them, and they worked so hard, and so did you. But not everybody is in that same boat, and a lot of students are still navigating this journey. And so I think that's the rubbing it in
Mm-hmm.
comes a bit more from parents, quite
Mm-hmm.
honestly.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I actually love what you said about, really like celebrating all your schools. Like I always try and work with my students to say, it's okay to say it's not your perfect match or it's not your best match. You prefer this other school, but don't put a school down
Yep.
ever. And the students who really embrace that, I just think, like, thank you so much. That's absolutely
Mhm.
wonderful. But yeah, the parents, it's interesting because even before I worked in college counseling, when I worked at the University of Chicago, every once in a while I'd get calls from parents who were just furious that their kid hadn't gotten in.
Oh yeah.
And that by itself, I was sort of like, I can understand that. They love their kid's dealing with a disappointment. But then the
Mhm.
ones that would then follow it up by saying so and so got in, they
Yes.
weren't as strong of a student,
Yes.
like, and the things they would say about these other students, and I would have read all the applications, because the call came to me and I wasn't allowed obviously to talk about why
Mhm.
a particular student got in versus theirs, but I was thinking, this is so appalling. I hope you're
Mhm.
not. I'd much rather they say it to me
Right.
than to anybody else in the high school community. And you would hear that when I was in the high school community too. It was
Mhm.
actually could get bad enough in some of the communities that some of my students decided, and I actually supported this, to not tell anybody where they got in and to only talk about where they were going. Once they had
Yes.
decided where
Mhm.
they were going, they would talk about it. But just to shut down some of the really negative parts of the rumor mill.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I find it really interesting because when parents talk to me and just say like, oh, so and so didn't get in, or I hear, oh, well, somebody got into an Ivy and got all this merit scholarship. I'm like, well, that didn't happen. I also
Right.
find it so interesting the lies that go around. And I said, well, that's just what they said. Or sometimes parents say, if somebody didn't get in, they say, oh, well, my kid decided to withdraw their application. It's probably not true. They probably did. So, I think that there's all, just stay in your lane. There's
Yeah.
a lot of just out of pride, I guess, that sometimes there's some fibs that
Mhm.
happen. And you just never know the whole story.
Mhm. Yeah, you really, really don't. Like, absolutely never. Even if this is someone who's close to you,
Mhm.
you're not going to know the whole story. And also part of it, I think, is because people sort of convince themselves of things. Like I worked occasionally with students who came from very prominent families for a variety of reasons, maybe the entertainment industry, etc. And I can promise you that those families were never going to admit that they had just made a major donation or they
Happens.
had, and I'm not naming any names and but like these things play a role too. This is not something you can control. So
Mhm.
just stay out of it. But you also don't know that that's the case. I mean, I
Right.
had a student who got into, many of the most selective colleges, and I can promise you that the students all assumed that they knew why. And I
Mhm.
I was like, as a high school counselor, again, there's a lot of stuff that's you're not allowed to talk about. But there, I was like, no, she's an amazing student, and you are forgetting that.
Yeah.
And I think you all know that.
Mhm.
Like don't forget that she's an amazing student. I'm not going to go into the rest of it, but don't forget that. So everybody just realize that there's a level to this process that's mysterious. And the other thing that I like to make sure people know is even the people who are reading the applications don't know who's going to get in or who's going to be prioritized
Sure.
or until the whole end of the process. Like they don't
Absolutely.
know. There's so many different factors that are decided on during the process, so keep that in
Mhm.
mind as well. So yeah, be kind, be kind. So what are some other ways to maybe be kind? Like what are some other things that can be done?
So when we're talking, some students, I agree with you. Some students don't share at all until they just in the place where they're going to enroll.
Mhm.
But there are some people to share with, and I saw this on the high school side. I see it now as a college counselor. It does blow my mind the people that have supported you along the way, where you don't share the good news.
Yeah.
We're on pins and needles. If you have a counselor, a teacher who wrote you a letter of recommendation, a coach who's been there every step of the way, and you're recruited after, whatever it is,
Mhm.
there are people that truly care about you and were willing to do those things to support you along the way. And to not share that news, it's kind of like saying, well, I don't think you really care about the outcome. And of course we do.
Yeah.
So that also just blows my mind that sometimes the radio silence with those that truly do care.
Mhm.
Um, and we don't get anything. And I don't need a long handwritten thank you note.
Right.
Would that be nice? Sure, I will always take it. But just to fill me in, or and I coach my students the same way. Go tell your teachers and thank them, not
Mhm.
just for making you a smart person and helping you, get attain the knowledge that you need to be successful in college, but to support you anywhere that letter of recommendation or whatever it was
Mhm.
along the way. Acknowledge it goes a long way.
Yeah. 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 I worked with a few students who I worked with them intensively on their essays, etc. This is as a high school counselor. And then they didn't tell me when they got in. And I was
Yeah.
like, really?
Yeah.
Like, I'm much more sympathetic, obviously, when students don't get in like that. They're probably
Mhm.
sad and they're grieving it. But if you have good news, please share it with the people who have assisted you along the way. They're really going to be happy to hear it
But I
for
have
you.
with the bad news too, though, that is why you have a support system. It's not
Right.
for the wins. It's also to help you navigate those losses and to say, okay, well, what's next? What's your next step? What do you have in your pocket,
Mhm.
and how can we celebrate that? So I think I think it is the wins and the losses, the good and the bad. However, you are sitting with it to share with the people that have supported you along the way,
Mhm.
is the right thing to do.
Yeah. Oh, definitely the right thing to do. Yeah, without a doubt. Um, Anything else? Like, I'm just trying to think, like, to me, those are sort of the biggest things
Mhm.
right there. So I'm just kind of curious if there's anything else that you can think of in terms of being kind.
I, I have a situation where, student wasn't kind. But I want this a little bit off topic, but I'm just going to throw it in there because I think there's one thing that colleges do. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
not kind,
Okay.
and a little bit off topic, but it's about this kindness. And it's complete. They are in their right to do this, but so I personally find it unkind. But colleges are allowed to kind of incentivize you students to to make a decision sooner. So if you get that early offer, they're allowed to throw things at you like priority housing. If you submit
Hmm.
your enrollment deposit, you get priority housing or some kind of perk. I find that unkind that colleges can kind of force students to make a decision before they're ready.
Hmm.
But I'm just going to throw it out there that they're allowed to. That might happen. That's just how it sits with me. But so I'm just putting it on that. It's not just not. I'm not only throwing students under the bus.
Hmm.
Sometimes colleges, I don't find it particularly kind to force a student to make a decision before they're ready. But it does kind of happen.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing too that I would say for a student who does get into their top choice, if they know that's where they're going, even if it was an early decision and they don't have an obligation, do let the colleges know that you're not going. Even if
Absolutely.
even if you haven't heard yet, even if you've submitted the applications, you did all this work, sometimes students are like, I just want to know what's going to happen. But
Mm-hmm.
let's just be fair to the college. Let's be fair to the other students applying. If you know you're not going, this is different if you're not sure. Like
Yes.
maybe you applied to one school, you got in, you're really, really happy, but there are two others that are really up there and you want to visit them again. Fair
Mm-hmm.
enough. But to stay with all your colleges, including the ones that are not quite as good of a match for you, that's unkind.
Absolutely. Put good karma out into the world. If you can release something that you know you're not going to go there for whatever reason, or even if the decision didn't come back yet, and that if you're an early decision applicant and you got in, you must withdraw your application. That is a must. That is not just kindness. That's what you agreed to.
Right. Yes.
So
yes.
put that karma, give that offer to somebody else that is on pins and needles waiting for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Unless you really need to hold out, maybe because you were admitted early action, but you're hoping for a scholarship from someplace else. Fair enough, but it really needs to be for a reason like that.
Yes.
So, okay. All right. Well, I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Absolutely, Sally. It's always good to be with you.
All right. So when we return, I'll be talking with Elise Krantz about the nuts and bolts of submitting applications and what to do once they have been submitted.